Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Van Halen Rising, How a Southern California Backyard Party Band Saved Heavy Metal, by Greg Renoff, narrated by Sean Runnette. Introduction. In the light of heavy metal's perennial popularity, it's easy to forget that the abrasive musical form was on the ropes by 1978. Bands that had packed coliseums just years earlier, such as Mountain, Deep Purple, and Grand Funk, had splintered and disappeared. Hugely successful acts like Kiss and Black Sabbath saw their album sales soften at a time when the industry enjoyed its greatest profits ever. Even Led Zeppelin, one of the genre's originators, hadn't released an album since the spring of 1976. As metal declined, other genres exploded. Punk rock, with its aggressive sound and nihilistic lyrics, took root in New York City and London. The growing movement, which was spearheaded in America by television and the Ramones, and in the UK by the Clash and the Sex Pistols, had conquered England, and seemed poised to do so in the States. As the trend-setting Seymour Stein of Sire Records predicted in late 1977, Boston, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles are all into punk now. By February and March of next year, I expect punk to explode in America. While punk had yet to prove its mass appeal, light rock had become a commercial colossus. Starting in the early 1970s, West Coast-based singer-songwriters, country folk artists, and soft rockers filled stadiums and dominated airplay. By 1977, its appeal showed no sign of subsiding. In fact, the latest releases from Los Angeles' two leading rock groups, Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles, each sold 4 million copies within 12 months of release. Then there was the throbbing beat of disco. What had begun in the early 70s as an underground urban phenomenon had become a national dance sensation. Radio stations of all stripes switched to the format, and the music industry revenues derived from disco totaled something like $4 billion annually in the late 1970s. The Billboard charts, naturally, reflected disco's ability to turn vinyl into gold. For example, the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, driven by the seemingly limitless appeal of the Bee Gees, sold an astounding 20 million copies in 1978 alone. And in perhaps the most powerful statement of the genre's chart power, rock acts like the Rolling Stones and Rod Stewart recorded their own disco-flavored singles. This three-pronged attack further corroded heavy metal's popularity. Punk's ferocious assault on metal's conventions rendered the once mighty Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath dinosaurs in the eyes of many rock fans. High school kids who came of age hearing hard rock from Ted Nugent and Aerosmith blasting out of their radios encountered the easy listening sounds of Peter Frampton and Jackson Browne on their FM dials by the time they were old enough to vote. Other young people traded leather for polyester and found their musical release on lighted dance floors rather than smoke-filled arenas. These trends led many industry observers to declare that metal's days were numbered. Cream, which had come to embrace punk, asked, "Is heavy metal dead?" Circus, which covered hard rock, queried, "Will heavy metal survive the 70s?" And "Why are rockers going disco?" Even rock critics who'd previously flown the metal flag stopped saluting by 1978. Sylvie Simmons gave the Motor City Madman a kick in the balls by writing, "Ted Nugent plays about the best powerhouse rock around. But that's not to say he isn't getting stale. Heavy metal music per se is getting stale." Lester Bangs, who was once known as America's greatest rock critic, concluded, "We might as well forget about heavy metal making a comeback ever." These trends and appraisals helped explain why Van Halen remained unsigned in Los Angeles for years before Warner Brothers Records snatched them up in early 1977. Record industry executives who encountered Van Halen, a quartet consisting of singer David Lee Roth, guitarist Edward Van Halen, drummer Alex Van Halen, and bassist Michael Anthony, had little use for the group. The conventional wisdom was that the singer, who didn't have the greatest chops, came off like a cheap imitation of the outdated Jim Dandy Mangrum of boogie rockers Black Oak, Arkansas. Likewise, the guitarist's playing was too uncontrolled to find a niche on commercial radio. In short, label executives thought the band was an anachronism. Moreover, Van Halen was too intense and aggressive even for A&R, artists and repertoire men, drawn to riff-based hard rock. Van Halen didn't sound much like the studio-crafted melodic Boston, the platinum act that in 1976 had produced the best-selling debut of all time. Van Halen sounded even less like Foreigner, the smooth, radio-friendly band that had broken through in 1977. An authority no less powerful than Kiss's manager, Bill Aucoin, told the band in late 1976 that they had no commercial potential. This, more than 3 years after the Van Halen brothers had joined forces with David Lee Roth. In the face of this seemingly intractable opposition, Van Halen didn't spend their time trying to drum up label support. Instead, they filled their calendar with bookings and gigged their asses off. Long before anyone outside of the San Gabriel Valley had heard of Van Halen, they played huge backyard parties, ones that saw sedate suburban streets play host to mini Woodstocks, and cemented their reputation as Pasadena's most outrageous and notorious local band. They performed at sticky-floor dives, providing the soundtrack for Los Angeles' first wet T-shirt contests. When the city's leading nightclubs wouldn't hire them, they put on their own concerts. And when an unsigned Van Halen opened for the powerful UFO in May 1976, they bulldozed the headliner, leaving no doubt that the quartet was ready for the big leagues. Van Halen's years in the wilderness also helped the band build a repertoire of amazing original material. While the band had cut their teeth as a cover band, they penned great songs as an unsigned act. Indeed, the band had written future Van Halen classics like On Fire, Runnin' with the Devil, I'm the One, House of Pain, Feel Your Love Tonight, and Little Dreamer, long before they recorded their debut album with producer Ted Templeman. Their constant gigging and outstanding originals helped the band build a large local following. Because Van Halen didn't have a record deal, their wide popularity surprised even veteran observers. Hollywood DJ and scene maker Rodney Bingenheimer was stunned by what he encountered when he went to the Pasadena Civic Auditorium in April 1976 to watch Van Halen perform in front of their hometown fans. As he told the Los Angeles Times, "When I got there, they had something like 2,000 kids in the place. They had put the show together themselves. Amazing." Generating this kind of impassioned support was the band's game plan from the get-go. "We campaigned hard to get a following when we started," Roth later explained. "All the time we were playing, we were drawing larger and larger crowds." In the spring of 1977, the band finally got a contract, and in February 1978 their debut dropped. Van Halen, an 11-track LP featuring a cover of the Kinks' mega-hit You Really Got Me, seemed to have a decent shot at charting, especially because it came with the backing of Warner Brothers Records and hit-making producer Ted Templeman. But industry tastemakers on both sides of the Atlantic took one quick listen to the adrenalized material on Van Halen and forecast that the quartet would meet the same fate as metal's moribund giants. Outlets like Hit Parader and the New Musical Express panned the album, suggesting that Van Halen had just recycled the heavy metal sound of years past. The influential Robert Christgau piled on by writing, "For some reason, Warner wants us to know that this is the biggest bar band in the San Fernando Valley." But Cream drew the most blood. Seeing Van Halen as the last of a dying species of metallic dinosaurs, the publication predicted that the quartet would find their evolutionary fulfillment in a quick extinction. In retrospect, it's clear that metal-averse critics didn't listen dispassionately to Van Halen. When they heard the ass-shaking swing of Ice Cream Man, they grouped Van Halen with boogie rockers like Foghat. When they heard the bottom-end stomp and monster riff of Runnin' with the Devil, they labeled Van Halen as a born-again Black Sabbath. When they heard the virtuosity of Eruption, they pigeonholed the band's guitarist as just another self-indulgent Ritchie Blackmore clone. They thought they'd heard it all before, and what they heard from Van Halen, they hated. In spite of the critical opposition, Van Halen started to sell. Driven by the first single, You Really Got Me, which topped out at number 36 on the Billboard Singles Chart, a buzz built about the band and their album. In early March, Van Halen cracked Billboard's Top 200 Albums chart and would eventually peak at number 19. In the meantime, Van Halen toured the world and performed like their lives depended on it. After years of gigging in Los Angeles, they were a tight and powerful band. In the spring, Van Halen pummeled melodic rockers Journey and monster guitarist Robbie Montrose, who kept them on the bill largely because they'd become a draw. Soon after, Van Halen left that tour for greener pastures, as the Pasadena Quartet's album went gold in America by selling 500,000 copies. In the months that followed, Van Halen stole the show everywhere they played. The band's creative consultant, Pete Angelus, who saw every date of the tour, remarks, "As the success grew, and it grew very quickly, at every venue and with every act that they played over or opened for, the response from the audience was just overwhelming." Van Halen was a hurricane of power and energy that devastated audiences and bands alike. By selling over 2 million albums worldwide and thrilling hundreds of thousands of fans in 1978, Van Halen kept heavy metal from slipping beneath the waves. Don't believe me? Consider the Billboard chart and sales performances of some other potential saviors, young hard rock metal bands that would become massive in the decade that followed. AC/DC's Power Age, which was released on May 5, 1978, stalled at number 133 and wouldn't achieve platinum status until 1981. Judas Priest's Stained Class, also a 1978 release, peaked at number 173 and wouldn't go gold until 1989. The Scorpions' Taken by Force, released in December 1977, failed to chart and has sold less than 500,000 copies to date. These talented acts, despite recording great records for major labels, were still some years away from their commercial breakthroughs. Van Halen, in contrast, broke big right out of the gate. It's always a rare feat when a brand-new band tops the charts and becomes an in-demand live attraction. But Van Halen had accomplished something even more remarkable. They'd transformed the staid sound of metal into something that sounded fresh and vibrant, an undertaking that many observers would have deemed impossible before Van Halen's street date. They pulled this off by performing an alchemical miracle on the album. They started by retaining metal's essential elements, the swagger and screams, the monster power chords and over-the-top guitar acrobatics, and the jackhammer rhythms. At the same time, they removed the abrasive impurities, the meandering song structures, fantastical lyrical themes, and doomy sound that had made metal unpalatable to many late 70s consumers. Then they added hooks so big they could land a whale and choruses so sweet they could rot teeth. With Roth's otherworldly screams and Edward Van Halen's groundbreaking guitar pyrotechnics dominating each of the album's 11 tracks, Van Halen had distilled heavy metal down to its essential elements. So when rock fans dropped the needle on Van Halen, they didn't hear lengthy, self-indulgent jams or lumbering, doomy dirges. On the contrary, they heard what Roth would later term big rock, a streamlined sonic assault that combined metal's power, energy, and virtuosity with shimmering pop sensibility. In doing so, they invented pop metal, radio-friendly hard rock catchy enough that it could sell millions in a musical climate that was flat-out hostile to the genre. In the end, Van Halen's success proved the theory of musical evolution, and made it difficult for critics and cynics to make the case that in 1978 heavy metal was doomed to extinction. By drawing up the lasting blueprint for pop-friendly hard rock and heavy metal guitar prowess, Van Halen redefined and reinvigorated hard rock at the very moment when it seemed destined for musical obsolescence and cultural irrelevance. Van Halen, in other words, saved heavy metal from the scrap heap. Remarkably, the way that Van Halen evolved into a band great enough to sell millions of records and skilled enough to electrify stadium crowds has been shrouded in mystery and supposition since Van Halen became famous. That's a pity, because before anyone outside of Los Angeles knew about the greatness of Van Halen, everything that has made the best episodes of Behind the Music must-see TV had already happened to the band. Van Halen's road to success wasn't smooth, and it wasn't short, but it was a dizzying, white-knuckle ride. Chapter 1. Beginnings. It's rare that something so loud comes to life in some place so quiet, but that's exactly how it happened with America's greatest rock band. In the 1970s, Van Halen evolved into a musical force in Pasadena, a Los Angeles suburb of white picket fences, tree-lined streets, and good schools. David Lee Roth reminisced about those environs on the band's 2007 reunion tour. The suburbs. I come from the suburbs, Roth told a packed house at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. You know, where they tear out the trees and name streets after them. I live on Orange Grove. There's no Orange Grove there, it's just me. We used to play the backyard parties there. I remember it like it was yesterday. But years before Van Halen ever disturbed the peace in Pasadena, the group's future members laid the foundation for a partnership that would make rock history. Soon after arriving in America in 1962, the Van Halen brothers resolved to become top-flight rock musicians. Likewise, David Lee Roth set his sights on becoming a rock singer, a rock star, as he'd put it, before he and his family even made it to the San Gabriel Valley in 1963. Van Halen didn't come to life until the early 1970s, but the band's true genesis dates back a decade prior. Before the Van Halen family made music in California, they made it in Holland. Jan Van Halen. Jan would begin capitalizing his surname's first letter after he arrived in America, was born in Holland on January 18, 1920, to Herman Van Halen and Jannie Berg. When the Netherlands fell to the Nazis in 1940, a young Jan joined the Dutch resistance, only to become a prisoner of war. After his Nazi captors discovered that he had an aptitude with the saxophone and clarinet, they placed him in an orchestra that toured German-occupied Europe. When the conflict ended, he played in jazz acts, hit the road as part of a circus orchestra, and later performed on live radio shows in Holland. He then relocated to Indonesia, where he met and married Eugenia van Beers. Our pop went over to Indonesia on a 6-week radio contract, which turned into 6 years, Alex recalled. After the fall of the Dutch-backed Indonesian government, the couple moved to Amsterdam, where they welcomed 2 new additions to their family. Alexander Arthur Van Halen, born on May 8, 1953, and Edward Lodewijk Van Halen, born on January 26, 1955. The boys had their musical baptism almost at birth. In Holland, they started taking piano lessons when Edward was about 5 years old. They also traveled with their parents as their father toured with jazz and big band acts during the late 1950s. We were taken all over the place, Alex explained to the Los Angeles Times. If my dad was going somewhere, we'd all go to the gig and hang out. My mom couldn't afford a babysitter. Edward added, growing up in Holland when me and Alex were 7 years old, we used to go across the border to Germany to clubs where he played. That was just normal to me, staying up to 2, 3 in the morning, hanging in the club. By 1960, Jan's career was on the ascent. His talents had earned him a spot in the elite Ton Vijkamp Quintet, which won honors at Holland's Loosdrecht Jazz Festival that year. Edward, reminiscing about his father's musical career in Europe, said, "My dad was one of the baddest clarinet players of his time. He was so hot. Unbelievably." Despite Jan's success, the Van Halen family began to consider relocating. Some of Eugenia's relatives, who lived in Southern California, had written to Jan and Eugenia and told them about the promise of American life. "We had some family that had moved to L.A., Alex said, and they were always writing letters about the beautiful weather, the ample opportunities, and whatnot." Convinced that Jan could find greater success in America, the Van Halen family departed Holland on February 22, 1962, by steamship. They carried with them a few suitcases, a Rippin piano, and about 75 guilders. To subsidize the cost of their passage, the family entertained their fellow passengers during the 9-day trip. Alex and I actually played on the boat while we were coming to America, Edward recalled. We played piano, and we were like the kid freak show on the boat. After arriving in New York, the family took a cross-country train trip to Southern California and settled in the prosperous Los Angeles suburb of Pasadena, having spent most of their savings to pay their way to America. As Edward would later summarize, "My father was 42 years old when he left Holland and came to Pasadena with $15 and a piano." Despite the city's advantages, the family's dream of a better life did not initially come to pass. Instead of finding themselves in a suburban dream home, the Van Halen family rented a cramped apartment at 486 South Oakland Avenue. Their new home was so modest that all three families in the building shared the same bathroom. Over the next 4 years, the family would relocate in Pasadena at least 2 more times. During their first months in America, the Van Halen clan had bigger problems than housing. "My dad couldn't speak the language, and he didn't even know how to drive a car, 'cause in Holland you ride bicycles, at least back then," Edward said, as he recalled his father's first American job as a dishwasher at Arcadia Methodist Hospital. Because his father didn't even own a bicycle, he walked 6 miles each way to work, and his mother pitched in by working as a maid. These difficulties led their youngest to call the American dream that had brought them to America a crock of shit. Of course, Jan had hoped to support his family through music. "For my dad, America was the land of opportunity," Alex remembered. Then he found out differently, of course. The big band thing wasn't happening here either. In fact, when it came time to provide the city of Pasadena with information for the 1962 city directory, Jan listed his occupation as a machinist. Nevertheless, Jan did find some part-time work as a musician. For the brothers, the language and cultural barriers that initially separated them from their peers drew the two together. Alex explained, "The only friends we had were each other. That's part of the reason we're so close. We knew no English whatsoever. It had a lasting effect on us in terms of being able to accept traveling and touring and not being sure what the next day brings." Edward agreed, adding, "We were 2 outcasts that didn't speak the language and didn't know what was going on, so we became best friends and learned to stick together." Still, in the months that followed, the brothers began to build friendships with kids they'd met in school and in their neighborhood. As the brothers acculturated, their parents' hard work began to pay off. On April 27, 1966, they purchased an 896-square-foot home located at 1881 Las Lunas Street in Pasadena. Still, the Van Halens remained far from prosperous. George Corville, who lived nearby and has known the Van Halens since he was 7 years old, remembers, "They had the smallest house on the block. These were all Pasadena bungalow homes. There were 2 bedrooms. The kids had one room and the parents had the other. There was a single bathroom, a living room, a dining room, and what they called a galley kitchen." Ross Velasco, who was a close friend of the brothers, recalls an incident that highlights life in the Van Halen household in the 1960s. "Alex and I had been down to the beach to body surf. Someone broke into my van when we were in the water and stole all of our clothes, even our shoes. So we drove back to Pasadena in our wet swimsuits. When we pulled up to Alex's house, his mother was at the door. She was such a sweet woman. He told her what happened, and she got very upset. I think at that time she might have been sewing and making the clothes he wore. She was most upset that he had lost his shoes." This hand-to-mouth existence prompted Jan and Eugenia to ponder their sons' futures. In their minds, music offered the best prospects, and so music lessons remained a staple in the brothers' lives. Alex and Edward took violin lessons while in elementary and junior high school, with Alex progressing well enough on the instrument to make the Los Angeles All-City Orchestra. But their parents had one particular hope for their children. "Mom had this grandiose idea of us becoming concert pianists," Alex told the Los Angeles Times. "We kept it up about 10 years. It made for a great foundation in music. You learned all the theory, and it forced you to listen to different kinds of music." While Edward's and Alex's years of piano lessons are a well-known component of the Van Halen story, less is known about who gave them lessons. Soon after settling in Pasadena, Jan and Eugenia hired an elderly Lithuanian pianist named Stanley Kalvaitis. He'd teach the boys for a stretch of years during the 1960s. From their first lesson onward, the brothers learned that Kalvaitis was nothing if not demanding and harsh. "I had this Russian teacher who couldn't speak a word of English," Edward told guitar player, "and he would just sit there with a ruler, ready to slap my face if I made a mistake." Despite the family's meager resources, Jan and Eugenia had not employed a run-of-the-mill teacher. Kalvaitis was a seasoned professional pianist and a 1914 graduate of the elite Imperial Conservatory in St. Petersburg, Russia, an academy that trained, among other musical greats, Pyotr Tchaikovsky. While at the conservatory, Kalvaitis studied under some of the greats of Russian classical music, including composer, pianist, and conductor Nikolai Cherepnin and violinist Leopold Auer. He also shared classrooms with luminaries like composer Sergei Prokofiev and violinist Yasha Heifetz. Edward and Alex, it turns out, learned piano from a musician who'd studied and played with world-class talent. In the case of Edward, these revelations cast his later guitar mastery in a new light. While he never took guitar lessons, his musical foundations came from formal study with an elite musician. Kalvaitis, who recognized his young pupils' gifts, entered them in the Southwestern Youth Music Festival in Long Beach between 1964 and 1967. As a contestant, Edward enjoyed success. "I was good," he told journalist Stephen Rosen. "You sit there and practice one tune for the whole year, and they put you in a category and judge you. I think I won first place twice and second place the last time." Despite Edward's achievements, neither Edward nor his brother enjoyed these lessons or thought much of their undergirding philosophy. Alex remembered, "We used to go to these contests where you were given a certain piece of music and they tell you to play it, and if you don't play it the way they interpret it, then you lose points. Well, I don't think music should be that way." Edward rebelled by memorizing the compositions rather than learning how to read music. Still, Jan and Eugenia indulged their children by letting them play other kinds of music with friends. Dana McDuff, who went to school with Edward and Alex, remembers one of these kiddie acts. "I was a third-grade student at Hamilton Elementary School. We'd have lunch outside near the pergola, and there'd be performances for the student body. One day there was a band playing. It was Ed and Al, and their band was called the Broken Combs. I was totally unaware that they were budding musicians. The pint-sized group, which featured Edward on the piano and Alex on tenor saxophone, was rounded out by Don Ferris on alto saxophone and the Hill Brothers on drums and guitar. They were just kids at our school. Ed played the piano. He was a year ahead of me. I remember the guy who was the leader of the group said, 'And now, your favorite and ours, Boogie Woogie.' They played that kind of music." For young boys who loved music but were less than enthusiastic about violin and piano, guitar-driven rock music had become a potent distraction by the mid-1960s. Edward noted that the brothers had been kind of sheltered from rock prior to their arrival in America. As Alex recalled, "Edward and I were seriously going to train to be concert pianists. But then the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five came along, and so it was goodbye piano." Alex, who'd begun taking flamenco lessons, now wanted an electric guitar, while his brother coveted a drum set. To pay for these instruments, the brothers became paperboys. Edward's childhood friend Raphael Marti remembers, "Alex had a double paper route." I think both of them had double paper routes, come to think of it. They used the money to buy equipment. It was beg, borrow, and steal with those guys. Before long, friction arose in the Van Halen household over Alex's and Edward's declining commitment to the piano and violin. Alex, who struggled to make progress on the guitar, saw his interest shift to drums, which he played with gusto when his brother wasn't around. Edward, in turn, took to guitar as he continued to play drums. Despite their parents' wishes, it became clear that the brothers' other instruments wouldn't be central to their aspirations. Within a short period of time, both brothers realized...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?